I was banished to the back row at my sister's wedding. My family ignored me. Then a stranger whispered, "Let's crash the VIP table." When he took the mic, my sister panicked. I am 28 years old, and while other women my age are busy climbing corporate ladders, attending networking mixers in tailored suits, and updating their professional social media profiles, I spend my life covered in a fine layer of powdered sugar. I smell perpetually of Madagascar vanilla, toasted almonds, and brown butter. I am a pastry chef working in a small, bustling, independent bakery in Brooklyn, New York. To me, the kitchen is a sanctuary. It is a place of absolute order and predictable chemistry. If you temper chocolate to the exact right degree, it will shine perfectly. If you fold a meringue with the right amount of gentleness, your macarons will rise with flawless little feet. It is a world where effort directly correlates with the result. There is no manipulation in baking. There is no line to a stand mixer. You put in the work, you follow the rules of the craft, and you create something beautiful that brings people genuine, uncomplicated joy. But out in the real world, particularly within the confines of my own family, effort and results have absolutely nothing to do with each other. I was reminded of this bitter reality on a rainy Tuesday morning when I checked my cramped apartment mailbox. Sandwiched between a stack of grocery store circulars and a utility bill was a heavy, oversized, cream-colored envelope. It felt significant in my hands, made of that thick, expensive cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than I spent on lunch for a week. The calligraphy on the front was done in an elegant, embossed gold foil, looping and swirling to spell out my name. I knew what it was before I even broke the wax seal. It was the official wedding invitation from my older sister, Stella. Stella was 31, beautiful in a very sharp, intimidating sort of way, and undeniably the golden child of our family. She was marrying a man named Carter, a 34-year-old rising star who was recently made a director at a major, extremely lucrative medical tech company. They were the perfect couple. They looked like they had been genetically engineered to grace the pages of a luxury lifestyle magazine. I stood in my tiny kitchen, still wearing my flour-dusted work clothes, and slid the invitation out of its sleeve. The details were meticulously laid out, announcing a black tie ceremony at a highly exclusive, sprawling private estate in the Hudson Valley. It was going to be the wedding of the decade, or at least, the wedding of my mother's dreams. Looking at that piece of heavy paper, a familiar, heavy ache settled directly behind my ribs. It was the ache of being remembered, but not actually wanted. I knew, with absolute certainty, that my name being on this guest list was nothing more than a social technicality. You cannot have a high society wedding and inexplicably exclude your only biological sister. It raises too many uncomfortable questions for the country club friends. It looks bad for the photographs. So, the invitation was sent. A formal summons for me to show up, stay quiet, and play the role of the supportive, somewhat embarrassing younger sibling who lacked the ambition to do anything meaningful with her life. I traced the golden letters of Stella's name with my thumb, fighting the urge to throw the whole thing into the trash can. I should have RSVP'd now. I should have claimed I had to work the weekend shift at the bakery. But the pathetic, lingering part of me, the inner child who still desperately wanted to sit at the grown-up table and be recognized as part of the family, forced me to check the box that said joyfully accepts. I dropped the card in the mail the next day, sealing my own miserable fate. To truly understand the suffocating dynamic of my family, you have to understand my mother, Sylvia. Sylvia is a woman who communicates almost entirely in microaggressions and backhanded compliments. She doesn't scream. She doesn't throw things. She simply wields disappointment like a finely sharpened scalpel, expertly slicing away at your self-worth while maintaining a perfectly serene smile. Take last Thanksgiving, for example. I had spent 3 exhausting days in the bakery after hours, meticulously crafting a spiced pumpkin cheesecake with an artisanal ginger snap crust, topped with hand-piped maple meringue. It was a masterpiece. I was so proud of it, carefully transporting it in a special box all the way to my mother's pristine suburban home. When I arrived and presented it, Sylvia gave it a brief, tight-lipped look, murmured a polite, "How quaint," and immediately instructed the housekeeper to place it on the overflow counter in the far corner of the kitchen, completely out of sight. Meanwhile, Stella had brought a standard, store-bought pecan pie from a high-end grocery chain. She hadn't even taken it out of the aluminum tin. Sylvia placed Stella's pie dead center on the dining room table, loudly praising her for being so incredibly busy and successful yet still finding the time to contribute to the family holiday. We ate the store-bought pie. My cheesecake sat untouched in the dark until I packed it back up and took it home to eat alone in my apartment. Then there was the wedding dress shopping trip 3 months ago. I had taken an unpaid day off work to be there. I spent 4 hours trailing behind Sylvia, Stella, and her 4 glamorous bridesmaids, none of whom bothered to learn my name. I was treated like a human coat rack, tasked with holding heavy designer purses and fetching glasses of champagne for the bridal party while they laughed and cried over layers of imported silk. Every time I tried to offer an opinion, Sylvia would gently pat my arm and say, "Oh, Hazel, dear, let's leave the styling to people who don't wear aprons for a living. You have such a unique, quirky taste, but this needs to be elegant." The message was always the same. I was the stain on their otherwise perfect canvas. This deep-rooted division began years ago when I made the unforgivable sin of choosing my own path. Sylvia had my entire life mapped out. I was supposed to go to a top-tier university, attend law school, and become a corporate attorney, just to have a title she could brag about at her charity luncheons. But I hated the law. I hated the aggressive, cutthroat environment. So, halfway through my undergraduate degree, I dropped out and enrolled in a culinary institute. The day I told my mother I wanted to be a pastry chef, she looked at me as if I had just announced my intention to become a professional bank robber. She didn't yell. She just poured herself a glass of wine, sighed heavily, and said, "Well, I suppose someone has to do the manual labor in the world. It's just a shame it has to be my daughter." From that day forward, I was officially demoted. I was no longer the daughter with potential. I was the cautionary tale. I was the family disappointment who chose a blue-collar life, making my mother deeply ashamed to answer the question, "So, what is Hazel up to these days?" The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in late June. It took me 2 solid hours to drive from the loud, gritty streets of Brooklyn up to the manicured, impossibly green landscapes of the Hudson Valley. My car, a reliable but decidedly unglamorous decade-old sedan, felt completely out of place as I pulled up to the sweeping iron gates of the private estate. Despite knowing exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy, I had spent entirely too much money on their wedding gift. I had visited a local artist's studio and purchased a stunning, handcrafted set of ceramic serving bowls, glazed in deep oceanic blues and greens. It was thoughtful, it was beautiful, and it cost me a significant chunk of my monthly rent. I convinced myself that maybe a mature, heartfelt gesture would finally bridge the gap. I arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a full 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I thought I could go to the bridal suite, offer my help with any last-minute emergencies, maybe steam a dress, or, at the very least, share a quiet moment with my sister before she walked down the aisle. I found the bridal suite in the main house. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the loud, bubbly chatter of women, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter snapping away. I took a deep breath, plastered a bright, supportive smile on my face, and pushed the door open slightly. "Hey, everyone," I said softly, stepping just inside the threshold. The laughter died down instantly. Stella was sitting in a velvet chair, her hair halfway up in elaborate curls, a makeup artist hovering over her with a brush. She glanced at me through the mirror, her expression blank, and then immediately looked back down at her phone, her thumbs typing rapidly. She didn't say a word. Before I could even take another step into the room, my mother materialized from the corner, blocking my path like a well-dressed security guard. She was already wearing her mother of the bride gown, an icy silver creation that looked rigid and uncomfortable. "Hazel," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What are you doing in here?" "I came early," I stammered, feeling my face heat up under the stares of the bridesmaids. "I wanted to see if anyone needed help. I can run errands or..." Everything is perfectly under control, Sylvia interrupted smoothly, placing a firm, cold hand on my shoulder and physically turning me back toward the hallway. We have a professional coordinator for errands. Honestly, Hazel, you bringing that frantic, flower-stained aura of yours in here is just going to stress the bride out. We are trying to maintain a very specific, calm energy. Why don't you go take a walk around the gardens? Don't come back to the main house until it's time to be seated. She closed the heavy wooden door right in my face. The click of the latch echoed loudly in the empty hallway. I stood there for a long minute, clutching my expensive gift, feeling a hot, humiliating tear prick the corner of my eye. I had driven 2 hours just to be treated like an annoying stray dog. I turned around and walked out of the house. I spent the next 2.5 hours wandering the vast, empty grounds of the estate by myself, sitting on a stone bench near a decorative fountain, staring at my phone and wishing with every fiber of my being that I had stayed in Brooklyn. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the estate began to fill with guests. The ceremony was taking place outdoors on a sprawling, perfectly manicured lawn that sloped gently down toward a private lake. The setup was breathtaking. Hundreds of white wooden chairs were arranged in perfectly symmetrical rows, separated by an aisle covered in thick, pale rose petals. Grand floral arches framed the altar space. It looked like a movie set. I made my way toward the entrance of the seating area, where 2 ushers in immaculate dark suits were directing guests toward an elaborate, mirrored seating chart displayed on an easel. I stood back and watched as extended family members, old family friends I hadn't seen in years, and Carter's wealthy colleagues eagerly found their names and were escorted down the center aisle to the prime seating in the first few rows. When the crowd thinned out, I approached the mirror. I started scanning the names under the immediate family section at the top. Carter's parents, Carter's siblings. My mother. I wasn't there. I moved my eyes down to the second row, the extended family and VIP section. Aunts, uncles, people I vaguely recognized from country club photos. My name wasn't there either. A cold dread started pooling in my stomach. I kept reading, moving down to row 3, row 4, row 5. Nothing. I finally found my name at the very, very bottom of the mirror, printed in small font. Hazel. Seat 84. I looked up from the board and stared out at the sea of white chairs. I started walking, counting the rows as I went further and further back. I walked past the college friends, past the business associates, past the distant cousins who hadn't spoken to Stella in a decade. I kept walking until there were no more rows left. I had reached the absolute back edge of the seating arrangement. Seat 84 was located on the far left side of the very last row. But it wasn't just in the back. It was positioned directly behind a massive, decorative stone pillar that supported a large, draping floral arrangement. The pillar was so wide that it completely blocked any view of the altar, the aisle, and the lake. If I sat in that chair, I would literally be staring at a block of stone. Worse than the pillar was the location itself. My chair was positioned right next to the gravel pathway leading from the catering tents to the main house. As I stood there, 3 waiters rushed past me carrying heavy trays of glassware, their shoes crunching loudly on the stones. I was sitting with the staff. I was placed in the holding area for the hired help. I placed my hand on the back of the wooden chair, feeling my knuckles turn white. This was not a clerical error by a distracted wedding planner. Wedding planners confirm family seating charts a dozen times over. This was deliberate. My mother and my sister had sat down together, looked at a map of this venue, and actively decided to place me, the bride's only sister, as far away and as hidden as physically possible. They didn't just want me out of the photographs, they wanted me out of their sightline entirely. They were deeply, fundamentally embarrassed by my existence. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A lifetime of trying to be a good daughter, of showing up to holidays, of buying thoughtful gifts, all of it amounted to absolutely nothing. I was nothing to them. I sat down in seat 84, staring at the cold stone pillar in front of me, and for the first time in my life, the desperate need for their approval simply evaporated, replaced by a dark, hollow, and profound anger. The classical music playing from the hidden speakers suddenly swelled, signaling the start of the ceremony. People in the rows far ahead of me stood up, craning their necks to watch the procession. From my vantage point behind the pillar, I couldn't see a single thing. I couldn't see the bridesmaids, I couldn't see my mother walking down the aisle, and I certainly wouldn't be able to see Stella. All I could see was the back of the pillar, the frantic movement of the catering staff organizing plates to my left, and the thick green bushes behind me. I sat completely still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling like an absolute ghost haunting my own family celebration. Well, this is certainly an exclusive viewing angle. The voice came from my right, low, smooth, and laced with heavy sarcasm. I startled, turning my head. A man had quietly slipped into the chair right next to mine, seat 85, which was equally obscured by the massive stone column. He looked to be in his early 30s, and he immediately stood out from the sea of standard black tuxedos. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that looked incredibly expensive, worn with a crisp white shirt without a tie, the top 2 buttons undone. He had dark, slightly messy hair, a strong jawline, and piercing, intelligent eyes that were currently staring dead ahead at the pillar with a look of extreme amusement. I believe, he continued, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs, that if we use our imaginations really hard, we can pretend the floral arrangement on this rock is actually the bride. It's a very pretty rock. I let out a harsh, involuntary breath that was half laugh, half sob. I quickly wiped under my eyes, hoping the dim lighting in the back row hid how upset I was. I think the rock has more personality, I muttered, surprising myself with the bitterness in my own voice. He turned his head to look at me, really look at me, and his amused expression softened slightly. "I'm Bennett," he said, extending a hand. "Hazel," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm and warm. "So, Hazel," Bennett said, lowering his voice as the faint sound of the officiant speaking echoed over the microphone from a mile away. "What heinous crime did you commit against the happy couple to end up in the penalty box with the catering crew? Did you spill red wine on the bride's dress? Embezzle from the groom's company?" "Nothing that exciting," I whispered back, watching a waiter aggressively adjust his bow tie 3 feet away from us. "I just exist. What about you? You don't exactly look like the kind of guy who gets relegated to the cheap seats." Bennett let out a quiet, cynical chuckle. "I'm a necessary business evil. My firm is currently evaluating a massive merger deal that the groom's company is desperate to secure. The head partner of my firm was supposed to be here, the VIP guest of honor. But he caught a horrific stomach flu yesterday. He sent me as his proxy at the last minute just to show face. No one in the groom's family has ever seen a picture of me. I showed up, gave my name, and the very stressed-out wedding coordinator panicked because I wasn't the 70-year-old man she had on her chart, so she shoved me back here out of the way. I'm essentially a corporate ghost." "Welcome to the afterlife," I replied. We sat in companionable silence for the next 20 minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of vows we couldn't hear and applause for a kiss we couldn't see. Once the ceremony concluded, the guests were ushered across the sprawling lawn toward a massive, open-air pavilion for cocktail hour. The space was packed, noisy, and overflowing with expensive champagne and circulating trays of miniature beef Wellingtons. I immediately sought refuge in the darkest, quietest corner I could find, standing next to a potted palm tree, hoping to run out the clock until I could reasonably sneak out and drive back to the city. I hadn't been standing there for 5 minutes when Bennett appeared, navigating through the crowd holding 2 glasses of champagne and a small plate piled high with appetizers. "I figured the outcasts should stick together," he said, handing me a glass. "Plus, judging by the way you were looking at the exit signs, I thought you might bolt without getting any free food." I was strongly considering it, I admitted, taking a sip. The champagne was incredible, obviously. We leaned against the wall, watching the crowd. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. There was no pressure, no pretense. We were just 2 strangers trapped in a high-society fishbowl. He asked me what I did for a living, and for the first time all day, I didn't feel the need to hide my profession. I told him about the bakery, about my crazy early morning hours, about the complex science of baking. He actually listened, asking intelligent questions about flavor profiles and the difficulty of running a small business in New York. In return, he told me about his work as a lead consultant, dissecting failing companies and rebuilding their corporate structures towards sustainable practices. He was incredibly sharp, focused, and passionate about fixing broken systems. So, Bennett said, taking a bite of a crab cake, "You know my tragic backstory of being the replacement guest. Now you have to tell me yours. Why did they put you behind the pillar? Are you an ex-girlfriend of the groom who refused to let go?" I looked down at my glass, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. No, nothing like that. I took a deep breath, deciding the truth couldn't possibly make the day any worse. I'm the bride's sister. Bennett completely stopped chewing. He lowered his plate, turning to face me fully, his eyes wide with genuine shock. You're kidding. You're the sister of the woman in the white dress? The one who just got married? Biologically, yes. Emotionally, no. I explained it briefly, keeping my voice steady. I told him about my mother's obsession with status, Stella's perfection, my decision to drop out of law school, and the Thanksgiving cheesecake incident. I told him about being barred from the bridal suite just a few hours ago. They put me in the back because they don't want to explain me to Carter's important friends. I'm an embarrassment. Bennett's expression changed. The easy amusement vanished, replaced by a sharp, cold anger. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes locking onto Carter and Stella, who were currently laughing and posing for photos with a group of older men in suits. That, Bennett said quietly, his voice hard, is the most pathetic, insecure display of elitism I have ever heard in my life. You are a highly skilled professional with a business in one of the most competitive cities in the world, and they treat you like dirt because you don't wear a pantsuit. Pretty much, I sighed. It is what it is. I shouldn't have come. Bennett stared at the happy couple for another long moment. Then, he looked down at me, a dangerous, thrilling spark igniting in his gray eyes. They put you at the staff table, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Then he set his plate down on a nearby cocktail table. Hazel. They're about to announce dinner. The groom's family and the most important corporate guests are seated at table 1, right in the center of the room. It's the ultimate VIP table. He held out his hand toward me. I am the lead representative holding the keys to the merger Carter wants more than anything in the world. So, let's crash the VIP table. Pretend to be my date. I stared at his outstretched hand. Every instinct I had developed over a lifetime of keeping the peace screamed at me to say no, to go hide in the back, to not cause a scene. But then I thought about the pillar. I thought about the closed door to the bridal suite. I thought about the cold, discarded cheesecake. Something inside me, a lifetime of quiet submission, finally snapped. I reached out and placed my hand in his. Lead the way. If you are enjoying this story of family drama and sweet revenge, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment down below with the name of the city you are watching from right now. Every single comment helps push this video to more people who love a good Reddit story. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's get back to the drama. The walk from the forgotten shadows of seat 84 to the absolute center of the reception hall felt like a slow-motion sequence in a movie. The main ballroom was stunning, draped in white silk and illuminated by hundreds of floating candles. Right in the middle of it all, elevated slightly on a carpeted platform, was table 1. It was a massive, circular table reserved exclusively for the bride and groom, their parents, and the most crucial VIP guests. Carter's boss, an intimidating, sharply dressed woman in her mid-50s named Valerie, was seated directly across from the newlyweds. I kept my hand firmly tucked into the crook of Bennett's arm. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs I thought it might crack them, but Bennett's posture was remarkably relaxed. He moved with the effortless entitlement of someone who had spent his entire life in rooms exactly like this one. When we reached the table, 2 of the reserved chairs were miraculously empty. The proxy guest and his +1. Without missing a beat, Bennett pulled out a heavy, velvet-backed chair for me, right next to Valerie. I sat down, smoothing my simple dress, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. Bennett took the seat beside me, adjusting his jacket and offering a polite, devastatingly handsome smile to the table at large. The reaction from my family was instantaneous and visceral. Stella, who had been in the middle of a delicate sip of champagne, froze, her glass hovering inches from her mouth. Her eyes darted from me to Bennett and back to me, her perfectly contoured face contorting into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. 2 seats away, my mother, Sylvia, looked as if she had just swallowed a whole lemon. Her eyes widened, and I could practically see the frantic calculations running through her head. She had explicitly instructed the wedding planner to hide me. Yet here I was, sitting at the head table, escorted by a man whose suit cost more than her car. Before Sylvia could formulate a discreet way to have security drag me out, Valerie turned toward us, her sharp eyes studying Bennett with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You must be the proxy from the consulting firm," Valerie said, extending a hand covered in diamonds. "I'm Valerie. Carter speaks very highly of the upcoming merger your team is facilitating. And who is this lovely young woman? I don't believe I saw you during the ceremony." "Bennett," he replied smoothly, shaking her hand. "And this is Hazel. She is incredibly modest, so she usually tries to stay out of the spotlight at these corporate-adjacent events." Valerie smiled warmly at me. "It is a pleasure, Hazel. Do you work in the financial sector with Bennett?" I opened my mouth, but Sylvia practically leaped across the table to intervene. "Oh, goodness no," Sylvia laughed, though the sound was brittle and high-pitched. "Hazel is, well, she is taking some time to find herself. She works in a little kitchen, baking muffins and things of that nature." The dismissal was so casually cruel, designed to immediately establish my inferiority in front of Valerie. But Bennett didn't even blink. "Actually," Bennett corrected, his voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Hazel is a master pastry chef. She designs complex, artisanal dessert profiles in Brooklyn. It is an incredibly demanding science. I actually consider her work to be far more analytical and structurally sound than most of the financial portfolios I review on a daily basis. The discipline it requires is staggering." Valerie's eyebrows raised in genuine intrigue. "A master pastry chef? How fascinating. I have tremendous respect for the culinary arts. It requires a level of passion most people in boardrooms completely lack." Sylvia's jaw snapped shut. She looked at Bennett as if he were speaking an alien language. For the next hour, over courses of seared scallops and filet mignon, I didn't hide. Guided by Bennett's subtle prompts, I engaged in a deeply intellectual conversation with Valerie about the logistics of sourcing sustainable ingredients and the management of a high-pressure commercial kitchen. Stella and Carter sat in a tense, miserable silence, unable to join the conversation, forced to watch the sister they had banished become the most captivating person at their own head table. As dinner concluded and the waiters began clearing the china, the room transitioned into the speech portion of the evening. We endured the standard, predictable toasts. Carter's father spoke about legacy and corporate synergy, managing to make his son's marriage sound like a successful corporate acquisition. The maid of honor gave a tearful, slightly drunken speech about how Stella had always been absolutely perfect since kindergarten. Throughout it all, there was not a single mention of the bride having a sister. I was entirely erased from the narrative of my own family. But I didn't feel the crushing pain I had expected. Instead, I felt a detached, clinical observation. Sitting next to Bennett, drinking $1,000 wine, I finally saw them for what they were, incredibly small, insecure people putting on a play. When the final scheduled speech ended and the polite applause died down, Bennett calmly wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, stood up, and signaled to the master of ceremonies. "Excuse me," Bennett's voice echoed out, commanding the room instantly without a microphone. He walked over to the podium, offering a charming smile to the bewildered MC, who quickly handed over the microphone. A heavy, confused silence fell over the ballroom. Carter frowned, leaning forward to whisper something to Stella. Sylvia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Good evening," Bennett began, his voice deep and smooth, carrying a natural authority that demanded absolute attention. "My name is Bennett. I am here tonight representing the primary consulting firm overseeing the upcoming structural changes for Carter's firm. While I am ostensibly here in a professional capacity, witnessing the union of two people is always a profoundly personal experience. Carter visibly puffed his chest out, a proud smile spreading across his face, assuming this was a public endorsement from a powerful ally. He couldn't have been more wrong. In my line of work, Bennett continued, pacing slowly across the small stage, we evaluate the true worth of an entity. We look past the glossy marketing materials and the expensive outer shells to examine the foundation. Because a company, much like a family, is only as strong and only as valuable as how it treats its foundational pieces. The quiet workers. The unseen talent. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Tonight, much has been said about perfection, Bennett said, his gaze locking directly onto Stella, whose smile was beginning to falter. But perfection is often just a facade. True value is rare. True talent is often hidden away because it intimidates those who rely solely on appearances. Bennett extended his hand, pointing directly at me. The spotlight seemed to physically follow his gesture, and 200 heads turned to stare at me sitting at table 1. I want to raise a glass to the bride and groom, certainly, Bennett said, raising his champagne flute. But I also want to raise a glass to the bride's sister, Hazel. A woman of extraordinary talent, resilience, and quiet dignity. A woman who builds magnificent things from scratch with her own 2 hands, while others simply inherit their success. May we all strive to recognize the true gold hiding in our own backyards before someone else realizes its worth and takes it away forever. To Hazel. And, of course, to the happy couple. He took a sip. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The insult was wrapped in such elegant, corporate-friendly phrasing that it took a moment for the wealthy crowd to decode it. But Carter understood. Valerie understood. And Stella certainly understood. Stella's hand shook so violently that she dropped her crystal champagne glass onto her dinner plate. The sharp shatter of glass echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. Carter turned completely pale, realizing the man holding the keys to his multi-million-dollar career had just publicly shamed him and his new wife for their treatment of the sister they had tried to hide. Bennett calmly handed the microphone back to the MC, walked back to the table, and gave me a soft, reassuring wink. The balance of power had officially shifted. The rest of the reception was a blur of forced smiles and panicked damage control from my family. Carter tried twice to corner Bennett near the open bar to casually smooth things over, but Bennett expertly deflected him with vague, intimidating corporate jargon about discussing their structural compatibility on Monday morning. Sylvia wouldn't even look in my direction. She spent the rest of the night hovering near the exit, looking like she wanted to evaporate into thin air. Around 11 o'clock, the wedding planner announced the grand send-off. Guests lined the stone pathway outside the venue, holding long, glowing sparklers as Carter and Stella made their exit toward a waiting vintage Rolls-Royce. I stood near the back of the crowd with Bennett. As Stella ran through the tunnel of sparks, her eyes caught mine for a fraction of a second. There was no joy in her expression. There was only fear and deep, unsettling confusion. She climbed into the car and they drove away into the night. The crowd began to disperse, heading toward the parking lots or the hotel suites on the property. The air in the Hudson Valley had dropped significantly, a crisp, biting chill replacing the afternoon heat. I shivered slightly, rubbing my bare arms. Instantly, I felt the heavy, warm weight of Bennett's charcoal suit jacket draped over my shoulders. It smelled like cedar, expensive dry cleaning, and something distinctly masculine. I pulled the lapels tight across my chest, looking up at him. "You didn't have to do that," I said softly as we began walking away from the main pavilion, taking a quiet, winding path around the edge of the dark lake. "The speech, I mean. You essentially threatened my brother-in-law's entire career." "I merely stated a verifiable fact about evaluating assets," Bennett replied, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "If Carter is stupid enough to let his wife dictate how they treat people, he is too stupid to handle a major corporate merger." It was a professional observation wrapped in a wedding toast. We walked in silence for a few minutes. The estate was quiet now, the only sound the gravel crunching beneath our shoes and the distant hum of the caterers cleaning up the kitchen tents. "Why do you care?" I asked, stopping to face him. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting his sharp features in silver. "You are incredibly successful. You move in circles with billionaires. Why spend your evening defending a pastry chef you met behind a pillar?" Bennett looked out at the water, his jaw tightening. For a moment, the untouchable, arrogant corporate shark disappeared, revealing something much more vulnerable. "Because I know exactly what it feels like to sit behind the pillar," he said quietly. "My family built a massive hedge fund. Generational wealth. Blood money, mostly. From the day I was born, I was groomed to take over. But I hated it. I hated the exploitation, the greed, the complete lack of ethics. When I was 25, I told my father I was leaving the firm to start a consultancy focused on green energy and sustainable business practices. He turned his head to look at me, his gray eyes intense. My father told me that if I walked out that door, I was no longer his son. I would be cut out of the trust, written out of the will, and erased from the family history. He told me I was a foolish disappointment. I walked out anyway. I felt a sudden, deep ache in my chest for him. "I'm so sorry, Bennett." "Don't be," he smiled, a genuine, soft expression that completely changed his face. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me. I built my firm from the ground up. But I recognize that look in your eyes, Hazel. The look of someone trying to shrink themselves to fit into a family that is too small to hold them. You have an incredible gift. You create joy for a living. Don't you ever let those miserable people convince you that you belong in the back row." He stepped closer, reaching out to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed against my cheek, sending a sudden, electric jolt straight down to my toes. "Have breakfast with me tomorrow morning," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "No fake dating. No corporate warfare. Just breakfast." I looked up at him, feeling the heavy burden of my family's expectations finally slipping off my shoulders, leaving me lighter than I had felt in years. I would love that. The next morning, the resort was a ghost town. Most of the guests had partied well past 2 in the morning and were currently nursing brutal hangovers in their rooms. I met Bennett in the sunlit, glass-enclosed dining room overlooking the estate's gardens. I was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, my hair pulled up in a messy clip, feeling completely stripped of the defensive armor I had worn the night before. Bennett looked equally relaxed in a dark Henley shirt, already sipping black coffee and reviewing a tablet. Over plates of eggs Benedict and fresh fruit, we didn't talk about my family. We talked about everything else. We talked about books, about the chaotic energy of living in New York City, about his favorite obscure jazz clubs in Manhattan, and my absolute refusal to eat anything containing artificial vanilla extract. It was effortless. For a man who practically held the fate of major corporations in his hands, he was surprisingly grounded and genuinely funny. As the waiter cleared our plates, Bennett set his tablet face down on the table and folded his hands, his expression shifting from casual to focused. "Hazel, before we leave today, I need to discuss something with you," he said. "It crosses the line between our personal connection and my professional life, but I think you need to hear it." I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a sudden flutter of nerves. "Okay, go ahead." "Valerie's company, the one Carter works for, is hosting a massive, high-profile corporate gala in exactly 6 weeks," Bennett explained. "It is meant to celebrate the finalization of the merger my firm is handling. It will be attended by 500 of the most influential medical and tech executives on the East Coast. It is a very big deal. And as of yesterday morning, Valerie fired their catering company because they failed a quality inspection." I frowned, trying to follow his logic. "Okay, that sounds stressful for her." "It is an opportunity for you," Bennett corrected gently. "Valerie was incredibly impressed by you last night. She respects passion. I want to set up an official tasting for you at her Manhattan office next week. I want you to bid on the dessert contract for the gala." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Bennett, no. I work at a small bakery in Brooklyn. We do local weddings and birthday parties. We don't have the infrastructure to cater a 500-person elite corporate gala. Besides, I don't want to get a job just because the guy I am sitting next to strong-armed his client into hiring me. That is nepotism. It is networking, Bennett countered smoothly, leaning forward. Hazel, listen to me carefully. I will not strong-arm anyone. I will simply make the introduction and secure you an hour in her boardroom. That is it. The rest is entirely up to you. You have to bring your best work. If your desserts are average, Valerie will politely decline and hire a massive catering conglomerate. But I tasted the macarons you gave me last night from your purse. You are not average. I stared at him, my mind racing. The imposter syndrome that my mother had so carefully cultivated over the years screamed at me that I would fail, that I would embarrass myself, that I was just a girl who played with flour. But then I remembered Sylvia's cruel dismissal at the head table. I remembered Stella's eye roll. If I get this contract, I said slowly, tracing the rim of my coffee cup, Carter and Stella will be at that gala. My mother will probably beg for an invitation just to rub elbows with the executives. Exactly, Bennett smiled, a slow, predatory grin that made my stomach flip in the best possible way. They will walk into the most important professional night of Carter's life, and they will be forced to realize that the entire event is anchored by the sister they threw behind a pillar. It is checkmate, Hazel. But only if your baking is as good as I know it is. I took a deep breath, terrified but exhilarated. Set up the tasting. The next 4 weeks were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, intense recipe testing, and the most intoxicating, slow-burn romance of my life. Bennett and I began dating properly. Despite his grueling schedule, flying to Chicago and Boston for meetings, he always made time for me. Sometimes it was a late-night dinner at a hole-in-the-wall noodle shop in Chinatown. Sometimes it was just him showing up at the bakery at 3 in the morning, sitting on a flour-dusted stool in the corner of my kitchen in a bespoke suit, answering emails on his laptop while keeping me company as I prepped croissants for the morning rush. He didn't try to fix my life or buy my affection. He simply provided a quiet, steady presence that made me feel incredibly safe. He tasted every single iteration of the dessert menu I was building for the gala bit, offering brutally honest but constructive feedback. When the day of the tasting with Valerie finally arrived, I was a nervous wreck. Bennett drove me to the towering glass skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. We rode the elevator up to the penthouse boardroom in silence. He squeezed my hand right before the doors opened. "You don't need luck," he whispered. "You're an artist. Show them." The tasting was an absolute triumph. I didn't present standard, boring sheet cakes. I built an experience. I served a dark chocolate and sea salt ganache tart with a hazelnut crust, so rich and complex it made Valerie close her eyes in appreciation. I presented miniature lemon basil pavlovas that shattered perfectly upon the first bite, and my signature honey lavender macarons, painted with edible gold leaf. Valerie sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wiping her mouth with a napkin. She looked at the remaining pastries, then looked up at me. "Hazel," Valerie said, her tone dead serious. "I have eaten desserts in Paris, in Milan, and in Tokyo. This is, without exaggeration, the most sophisticated flavor profiling I have experienced in a decade. I don't care that your bakery is small. I want this exact menu for the gala. We will provide you with full access to the venue's commercial kitchen and a blank check to hire whatever prep assistants you need for the week." She slid a thick folder across the table. It was the contract. The compensation number printed on the bottom line was staggering. It was $50,000. More money than I made in an entire year for one night of work. I signed it on the spot, my hand shaking with a mixture of disbelief and fierce, hard-won pride. Bennett took me out for champagne that night to celebrate. Sitting in a dimly lit booth in a speakeasy, he raised his glass to mine. "To the artist," he said softly, his eyes dark and warm. He leaned across the table and kissed me for the first time. It tasted like expensive champagne and adrenaline, and it felt like the absolute beginning of the rest of my life. During the 5th week, just days before the gala, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Stella's name. I stared at it for a long moment before answering, entirely prepared for whatever manipulative tactic was coming. "Hazel." "Hi. Stella's voice was aggressively cheerful, a tone she only used when she wanted to borrow clothes she had no intention of returning. It has been far too long. I know things were a little tense at the wedding, but I really want to catch up. Let's get lunch today. My treat. There is a fabulous new French bistro in Soho I want to try. I knew exactly what this was. Carter was panicking. The merger was in its final stages. Bennett was the gatekeeper, and Carter needed to ensure that his wife's estranged, embarrassing sister wasn't whispering poison into the ear of the man who controlled his destiny. Carter had undoubtedly forced Stella to play nice. "Sure, Stella," I said neutrally. "Text me the address." The lunch was a masterclass in passive-aggressive probing. Stella arrived wearing head-to-toe designer labels, ordering a salad she barely touched. For 20 minutes, she subjected me to rapid-fire questions disguised as sisterly interest. Where did Bennett live? How serious were we? Did he mention Carter's performance metrics at work? I answered with vague, non-committal murmurs, enjoying the mounting frustration behind her heavily manicured smile. Finally, she snapped. "Look, Hazel," Stella said, dropping the sweet voice, her true, icy demeanor bleeding through. "Let's be real. We both know you and Bennett are a bizarre match. He is high society. You smell like yeast. Carter is very concerned that you might say something foolish that reflects poorly on our family. You embarrass us enough as it is with your little bakery job. Please, just don't ruin Carter's career because you want to play pretend in a world you don't belong in." There it was. The ugly, unfiltered truth. A month ago, those words would have sent me running to the bathroom to cry. I would have internalized the shame, believing her completely. But looking at her now, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just profound pity. Stella's entire self-worth was tied up in her husband's title and the approval of people who didn't care about her. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, and she hated me because I had figured out how to fly free. I calmly wiped my mouth, picked up my purse, and stood up from the table. I pulled 3 $20 bills from my wallet, $60, and dropped them onto her untouched salad. "That should cover my half," I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "You don't need to worry about me embarrassing you ever again, Stella. I am entirely done apologizing for being myself, and I am entirely done pretending we are a family. Enjoy your lunch." I turned and walked out of the restaurant, stepping out into the bright New York City sunshine. I didn't look back. The invisible chains that had bound me to my mother and sister for 28 years simply dissolved into thin air. I was free. The night of the corporate gala arrived like a thunderstorm. The event was held at a historic, palatial ballroom in the heart of Manhattan, featuring vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and a massive stage. For the past 48 hours, I had lived in the subterranean commercial kitchens beneath the ballroom, commanding a team of 6 hired pastry assistants. It was pure, beautiful chaos. We baked, we piped, we torched, and we plated 500 individual works of edible art. By 6 in the evening, the grand dessert pavilion, a massive, tiered, circular table situated directly in the center of the ballroom, was fully assembled. It was breathtaking. A cascading display of chocolate, gold leaf, spun sugar, and vibrant fruit, all softly illuminated by targeted spotlights. It was the absolute centerpiece of the room. At 7 o'clock, I retreated to a private dressing room Valerie had set aside for me. I washed the flour out of my hair, scrubbed the smell of butter from my hands, and opened the garment bag Bennett had sent over that morning. Inside was a silk gown in a deep, vibrant shade of emerald green. It fit me like a second skin, elegant and powerful. I pinned my hair up in a sleek twist, put on a deep red lipstick, and looked in the mirror. The exhausted, insecure girl who hid behind the pillar was completely gone. A soft knock came at the door. I opened it to find Bennett standing there in a classic black tuxedo, looking like he had just stepped out of a James Bond film. He looked me up and down, his breath hitching slightly. "You are a masterpiece," he murmured, taking my hand and kissing my knuckles. "Are you ready?" "More than ready," I smiled. We walked into the ballroom together just as the cocktail hour was transitioning into the main event. The room was packed with the most elite executives in the city. The energy was electric. Bennett led me through the crowd, his hand resting securely on the small of my back. It didn't take long to spot them. Near the front of the room, desperately trying to network with a group of senior vice presidents, stood Carter, Stella, and my mother, Sylvia. Sylvia had apparently leveraged Carter's position to secure an invitation, desperate to be seen among the wealthy elite. They looked incredibly tense, laughing too loudly, trying too hard to look like they belonged. As we walked past their orbit, Stella happened to turn her head. She saw Bennett first, her face breaking into a desperate, eager smile, ready to rush over and grovel. Then, her eyes shifted to the woman on his arm. She froze. The smile melted off her face, replaced by utter, paralyzing shock. She tapped Carter's arm frantically. Carter turned, his jaw dropping open. Sylvia followed their gaze, and for a moment, I honestly thought my mother might faint. They stared at me in the emerald gown, standing tall, radiant, and completely ignoring their existence as we glided past them toward the front row tables. Halfway through the evening, the lights dimmed, and Valerie stepped up to the grand podium on the stage. A hush fell over the 500 guests. Valerie spoke eloquently about the successful merger, the future of the company, and the hard work of the consulting team, specifically acknowledging Bennett's brilliance. Carter clapped enthusiastically, looking relieved, assuming the business portion of the night was over and his job was secure. Before we conclude and open the dessert pavilion, Valerie continued, her voice echoing through the massive speakers. I want to take a moment to acknowledge a new, vital partner to our corporate family. Tonight's spectacular culinary centerpiece was not created by a faceless conglomerate. It was designed and executed by a local artisan who possesses a level of talent and dedication that represents the exact core values of our newly merged company. I felt Bennett's hand squeeze mine under the table. I am thrilled to announce, Valerie smiled brightly, looking directly at our table, that we have signed a 5-year exclusive corporate partnership with her bakery. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the true star of tonight's event, our new executive pastry chef, Hazel. Hazel, please come up here. The spotlight swung instantly, blindingly bright, pinning me in my seat. The entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. I stood up, smoothing my emerald gown, and walked confidently up the velvet stairs to the stage. I stood next to Valerie, looking out over the sea of faces. My eyes immediately found my family. They were standing in the third row. The expressions on their faces were something I will remember for the rest of my life. Carter looked physically ill, realizing that his job security and his company's events were now inextricably linked to the woman his wife had treated like garbage. Stella looked completely hollowed out, her entire worldview collapsing as she watched her embarrassing sister receive a standing ovation from the billionaires she worshipped. And Sylvia, my mother, looked devastated. She was forced to raise her hands and clap for the daughter she had hidden in the kitchen. She realized, in that agonizing moment, that she no longer held any power over me. I had outgrown her, outshone her golden child, and I had done it entirely on my own terms. I didn't glare at them. I didn't offer a smug smirk. I simply looked past them, offering a gracious, professional smile to the room at large, and thanked Valerie for the opportunity. I stepped off the stage and walked back to the man who loved me, leaving my family drowning in the applause meant for me. Fast forward 1 year later. My bakery has tripled in size. We moved into a massive commercial space to handle the influx of corporate contracts that flooded in after the gala. Bennett and I live together in a beautiful, sunlit loft in Manhattan. We are planning a wedding of our own for next spring. It will be small, intimate, and attended only by people who actually love us. Looking back, my sister and mother keep sending me cards and leaving voicemails, begging to be a part of my new successful life, constantly repeating that family is forever. I haven't answered a single one of them. Am I wrong for completely shutting the door on my own blood, or should I finally accept their apology? Thank you for watching this story to the very end. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next drama.